Carol Lee.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned San Bernardino and Orlando, and Americans have been warned that similar attacks could happen here in the United States, and obviously what happened this week in Minnesota and Louisiana and Dallas. These are not necessarily the same types of attacks, and the motivations may be different, but collectively they're having a real impact on the American public, and in that there's a real anxiety out there where people are genuinely afraid going about their daily lives doing routine things.
Right.
So my questions are, do you see any sort of common thread in these events? Is this sort of just a new normal? Is there anything that you can do about this? And what's your message to Americans who are genuinely afraid? Because the anxiety just seems to be getting worse, not better, and these attacks keep seeming to happen in much more regularity that wasn't a part of their experience even, say, a year ago.
Well, Carol Lee, I do think we have to disentangle these issues. When it comes to terrorist attacks, people are understandably concerned, not just because of what's happened in the United States, but what happened in Brussels and what's happened in Paris and what's happened in Turkey and what is consistently happening in Iraq and Bangladesh and all around the world. And that's why the work that we've done with NATO and our counter-ISIL coalition and other partners is so vital. One of the things that's been commented on is that as ISIL loses territory and the fraud of the caliphate becomes more obvious, they're going to start resorting to more traditional terrorist tactics. They can't govern, they can't deliver anything meaningful to the people whose territory they can control. The one thing they know how to do is kill. And so we're going to have to redouble our efforts in terms of intelligence, coordination, our counter-messaging on extremism, working closely with Muslim communities, both overseas and in our own countries, to make sure that we are reducing the number of people who are inspired by their message or are in some coordinated fashion trying to attack us. And obviously we have built up a huge infrastructure to try to do that. The more successful we are in Iraq and Syria and Libya and other places where ISIL has gotten a stronghold, the weaker they are, the less resources they have, the less effectively they can recruit. But when individuals are willing to die and they have no conscience and compunction about killing innocent people, they are hard to detect, and it means that we've got to continually up our game. Having said that, I think it is important to note just the success that we've seen in the last several weeks when it comes to rolling back Al-Qaeda. You know, the liberation of Fallujah got a little bit lost in the news, but that's a big town. And with our support, the counter-ISIL coalition support, the Iraqi government was able to move through there quickly. They're now positioning themselves so that they can start going after Mosul. In Syria, you're seeing progress along a pocket, Majim, that has been used for foreign fighter flows. And so they're on their heels, and we're going to stay on it. Now, when it comes to crime generally, I think it's just important to keep in mind that our crime rate today is substantially lower than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, over the last 4 or 5 years, during the course of my presidency, violent crime in the United States is the lowest it's been since probably the 1960s, maybe before the early 1960s. There's been an incredible drop in violent crime. So that doesn't lessen, I think, people's understandable fears if they see a video clip of somebody getting killed. But it is important to keep in perspective that in places like New York or Los Angeles or Dallas, you've seen huge drops in the murder rates. And that's a testimony to smarter policing, and there are a range of other factors that have contributed to that. So that should not, we should never be satisfied when any innocent person is being killed, but that should not be something that is driving our anxieties relative to where we've been in the past. And with respect to, finally, the issue of police shootings, there's no doubt that the visual records that we're seeing have elevated people's consciousness about this. But as I've said before, for African Americans or Latinos in the pre-smartphone age, I don't think that people were not aware of the fact that there is evidence of racial bias in our criminal justice system. It's been well documented, and it's been experienced. And even before I got to the U.S. Senate, when I was in the state Senate in Illinois, I passed legislation to try to reduce the incidence of racial profiling by collecting data, and that was prompted by evidence that it was taking place in certain parts of the state. And the fact that we're aware of it may increase some anxiety right now, and hurt and anger, but it's been said, sunshine's the best disinfectant. By seeing it, by people feeling a sense of urgency about it, by the larger American community realizing that, gosh, maybe this is a problem. And we've seen even some very conservative commentators begin to acknowledge this is something maybe we need to work on. That promises the possibility of actually getting it done. So it hurts. But if we don't diagnose this, we can't fix it. Aisha Roscoe, Reuters.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you come to the end of your term, there's a lot of talk about your legacy. I know you may like to leave that to the historians, but but when you look back on your presidency and consider race relations, what